In this video, I'm going to talk to you about operant conditioning. Operant conditioning was proposed by B.F. Skinner some years after Watson and classical conditioning were applied to humans. Um, Operant conditioning involves the role of consequences. So it's really distinguished from classical conditioning because it's focused on what happens after the behavior, less so on what happens before the behavior, although that's important as well. You can think about behavior as having kind of three parts. One is the antecedent, or what happens before the behavior, that usually sets off the behavior or prompts it in some way. And then there's the behavior itself, and then there's the consequence, which is a stimulus that happens after the behavior that usually serves to either strengthen or weaken the behavior. Okay, and so Skinner looked at, did a number of experiments with animals, rats and pigeons, to see how does learning occur through operant conditioning. He devised a box, and it's an operant conditioning chamber, and it's referred to as a Skinner box, and it has a lever that an animal can press the lever to cause food to be dispensed as a reward. And so you can see that there are some different stimuli in the box, as well as the lever itself, and then the food that comes out, the dispenser of the food. Before I get into the specifics of it, there are a couple of terms that I wanted to review, and one is positive. So in operant conditioning, if you say positive, you're adding something. You're introducing a stimulus following a behavior. And negative is taking something away or removing it. And there are two different effects it could have on the behavior. One is to increase it, which is called reinforcement, and one is to decrease it, which is called punishment. It's not uncommon for negative reinforcement to get confused with punishment, because a lot of times people think negative reinforcement may be scolding a child, but scolding a child is actually meant to be punishing, meant to decrease a behavior. So scolding wouldn't be negative reinforcement, it would be punishment. So positive reinforcement is something that is added to increase the likelihood of a behavior. Okay, so if you study for a long time and you get a good grade on an exam, you may be more likely to study the next time you have an exam coming up. That would be an example of a reinforcement. A paycheck, obviously, that's positive reinforcement. It'll keep us working. Praise can be positively reinforcing as well, although it could also be punishing. It depends on the situation. It's important to note that no stimulus by itself is inherently reinforcing. It depends on how it affects a particular behavior. And usually because whether or not it's perceived as something that is desirable or aversive to the person. So introducing a desirable consequence or stimulus would be positive reinforcement. And removing something that is usually an aversive stimulus would be, to increase the behavior, would be negative reinforcement. So for example, if you get into your car and you don't put in your seatbelt and you start to drive away and your car makes a beeping sound, you would click that seatbelt to make the beeping sound go away. That is a perfect example of negative reinforcement because, and it was designed to be negative reinforcement of wearing your seatbelt. Okay, it really wanted to increase the behavior of wearing your seatbelt. Punishment is something that you do to try to decrease the behavior. Okay, so positive punishment is when you add something to decrease the likelihood of behavior, usually an aversive stimulus. For example, scolding a student for texting in class. Okay, you want the person not to text in class. If you scold them, the idea is they'd be embarrassed, they would want to avoid that happening again, so they wouldn't text in class. Again, that could depend on the situation. That could also depend on the individual. Maybe they like the attention that they get for texting in class, and so that might not decrease the behavior. But but the idea is that it would. And that's called positive punishment. A little bit of an oxymoron, it seems like, right? Punishment's not usually thought of as positive. Negative punishment is removing a stimulus to decrease the likelihood of a behavior. This is usually taking away something that is valued by the individual. For example, taking away a toy, taking away screen time, time with friends, privileges, use of the car. These are all negative punishment, forms of taking away something. Timeout is a classic example, too, of negative punishment. It is really meant to decrease undesired behaviors by taking the child out of what should be a reinforcing situation, okay? Timeout, the full name of that is actually timeout from positive reinforcement, even though it's not always used that way. And timeout can actually be reinforcing when it's taking the child out of a situation that they don't want to be in, and which could be a class with a demand that they don't want, that they are trying to avoid or escape. But in general, negative punishment is taking away something desirable to decrease a behavior. So there are lots of different ways to reinforce a behavior. Rewards can vary from primary reinforcers, things like food or candy or privileges or sleep or time with friends. Those are all kind of innately reinforcing. There's also secondary reinforcers, which are more tokens. It could be money. Money is really a secondary reinforcer because it leads to something that is a primary reinforcer. Praise can be a secondary reinforcer because it's linked with affection or recognition, something that is more of a primary reinforcer. Stickers can be primary or secondary reinforcers. It depends on the child. The child may really like the sticker and they work for the sticker. Or a sticker could just be something to, that accumulates toward a reward. Okay, so there's some things that could be either or both, but it depends on the situation. Okay. Reinforcement can occur continuously or it can occur partially. Continuous reinforcement is usually a great way to reinforce behaviors as someone is learning them. If you'd ever taken your dog to a training, usually you reinforce that dog constantly when you're teaching them to sit or to lie down or to stay. They get reinforced every time they exhibit the behavior. But it may not be practical to give them a treat every single time. And so you can also implement a partial reinforcement schedule, usually once the behavior is established. That would be they don't get reinforced every time, but they get reinforced intermittently, sometimes. And there are 4 types of schedules for partial reinforcement. They vary among 2 dimensions. The first dimension is interval versus ratio. Interval has to do with the amount of time getting reinforced over a period of time. Could be every 5 minutes, could be an hour. Usually for a more continuous behavior, say studying. I don't know if you've ever told yourself you'd study for an hour and then you go get a coffee. That was kind of an interval reinforcement, right? You're making yourself study for that hour and then you're going to go get your coffee. A ratio is really has more to do with the number of responses. So once you've taught your dog to sit, you can have them sit and you reinforce them every 3rd time they sit, as opposed to every single time. The second dimension is fixed versus variable. Okay, so the fixed would be the number of responses doesn't change between reinforcements or the amount of time. It doesn't change. So they're reinforced every 3 times they sit. You're reinforced every hour you spend studying. Variable would be that it varies between. So it could be that I reinforce the dog the first 2 times and then I wait and then I don't reinforce them again until the 5th time, and then I reinforce them the 7th time and the 10th time and the 13th time. And the dog is not able to predict then when they're going to get reinforced. And that would be a variable schedule of reinforcement. These partial reinforcement schedules do lead to different types of responding. Usually the variable ratio and variable interval schedules produce more consistent responding, and the fixed interval and ratio schedules tend to produce what's called a post-reinforcement pause. Once they get the reinforcement, sometimes they'll stop. A fixed interval schedule, especially because they know another 5 minutes is going to go by before they will get their reinforcement again. So they might pause after they've done it, and then they pick up the behavior when it's time to get reinforced. So, using partial reinforcement can be more practical, and it can be a good way of maintaining behavior. Gambling, for example, pulling a lever on a slot machine is something that is reinforced at a kind of a variable ratio schedule. We don't know when it'll happen, so it might keep us putting that quarter or that dollar into the slot machine in hopes of getting that next reinforcement. Also, they tend to be pretty resistant to extinction. Again, the longer you go without reinforcing a behavior and then reinforce it, the harder it is to get rid of that behavior. So that could be a good thing if you're really trying to develop a behavior that is maintained over time. Shaping is another tool that's used to teach new behaviors. It's helpful when you can't tell somebody how to do something. You can reward successive approximations toward the behavior. An example of this would be in the Skinner box, how Skinner would train these animals to push the lever. They don't go into the box knowing to push the lever. They have to be trained to do it. So he would shape their behavior in that every time they turned toward the lever, he would dispense some food. And then he would stop dispensing the food unless they touched the lever with any part of their body. And then they would get the food. And then once that was established, then he would make it so that they had to touch it with their paw or they wouldn't get the food. So then once they touch it with the paw, that gets reinforced. And then once they can press the lever, then they're only getting reinforced for that desired behavior. And that's an example of shaping. So we see applications of operant conditioning in a number of different areas of life. It's used a lot in education to manage behavior and also to teach skills. Sometimes reinforcers are used to teach skills. Grades can be thought of as a kind of reinforcer. They tend to motivate students to work. Sometimes teachers will use rewards also to reward academic behavior. Teachers will implement token economies, and token economies are also implemented in prison settings and institutional settings to keep people behaving, following the rules. Contingency contracting is another example of how it's used for behavior management. Sometimes a student and an adult in a school will make an agreement that if the student performs a certain behavior at a certain level, they will receive a pre-selected reward. And so contingency contract is another behavior management technique that is based on operant conditioning. Operant conditioning also can be used to teach verbal behavior in kids with severe autism, for example, or other disabilities where they're nonverbal. In some cases, applied behavior analysis, which is based on operant conditioning, can be used to teach verbal behavior. And then, of course, animal training. I've used a couple of examples already of animals, animal training and how reinforcement is used for that, either obedience training for dogs or even training for performances. So if you've ever seen a show at SeaWorld, you've probably noticed that the trainers are throwing fishes at the dolphins and the whales after. So that was operant conditioning.